joining us for more on John Kerry's nomination. We're joined by Henry Olson. Henry's the Vice President at the American Enterprise Institute, and he joins us via Skype from Potomac, Maryland. Good afternoon, Henry. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. We just heard our Bryn Weiss, our Washington bureau chief, talk a bit more about Senator Kerry being the nominee for the Secretary of State. What more can you tell us about his background that really hasn't been known, even though he did run for president just a few short years ago?
Well, he's somebody who has, as President Obama said in the spot that you listened to, really, in a sense, prepared for this all his life. It's wanting to become Secretary of State, wanting to become Foreign Relations Committee Chairman, were long-stated goals of his. And consequently, he knows world leaders. He knows a number of the issues that he'll already have to deal with. He's personally been involved in that. So in this sense, he'll probably be one of the more experienced secretaries of state to be appointed in either a Republican or a Democratic administration in recent years.
Certainly his experience in the Senate goes a long way towards the idea that President Obama is looking for a stronger voice in the House. This is also the first salvo in the creation of a new cabinet for the president. Does this give any indication to which way he's leading with other appointments?
I don't know that it gives an indication to other appointments, but I think it does give an indication as to a continuation of what the president has wanted to do with his foreign affairs that's rather distinctive for Americans. And that is that he wants the Secretary of State to build coalitions behind Americans' influence, but not necessarily leading from out front. That's a philosophy that John Kerry, when he was running for president, articulated not quite as directly as that. And I think what he's going to do is fit very smoothly into the Obama administration's foreign affairs and foreign policy teams.
That philosophy of leading from behind, Henry, has created a lot of criticism for the president in his first term. Why does he think that's going to be even more effective or popular with the American public and his critics this time around? Or does he even have that expectation?
Well, I don't think he expects it to be popular with the critics, but the president sees that in the polls, foreign policy was considered to be a plus for his reelection, not a minus. He won with 4% of the vote margin over Governor Romney. I think he would look out and say that he's had a very successful first term, no major crises internationally, a wind down of the war in Iraq, a wind down of the war of Afghanistan. I think he would look at Libya and what's happening in Syria as affirmations of his foreign policy. So from his perspective, I wouldn't see that there would be any reason to change, and I would think he would be very comfortable with somebody who would be very articulate and effective in advancing his viewpoints.
Henry, looking ahead to the next cabinet for the president, we talked a bit about the direction that he's heading with that. I mean, just like you said, a reaffirmation of what he accomplished in his first term. What do you see as goals for this president and his cabinet in this second term?
Well, in foreign policy, I think he's going to continue what he started in the first term, which is a shift away from American military power being exercised unilaterally, a shift away from investment in large-scale military weapons and towards a smaller military. I think that's what will be signaled with the defense secretary appointment, and a continuation of his first-term agenda domestically, which is, I think the president saw that he took a number of political risks in expanding the role of government in the United States. I think he saw the election as a reaffirmation of that, and I see no indication that he will choose a cabinet that is anything but 100% in line with the sorts of objectives he's been pursuing for 4 years.
Are these, excuse me, are these policies influenced by his economic way of thinking to a certain extent, Henry?
Well, he has a very comprehensive worldview, I believe, about America's role overseas and America's obligations to its own citizens. And he's been pursuing that rather doggedly. He does not believe that America is best served in the world by being feared, but rather by being loved. And he believes that the exercise of military power in a unilateral fashion leads to being feared or hated rather than being loved. And domestically, he believes that America has all too often, particularly since the Reagan administration, supported the advancement of the few at the expense of the many. And that's what the Dodd-Frank bill, that's what Obamacare, and that's what a number of his other stimulus and less publicized spending initiatives were about, was redressing that balance. So I don't think the foreign policy view is driven by his economic view. I rather think that they are two sides of the same coin, which is a very well thought out vision for America.
To that extent, Henry, then maybe this is a third side to that same coin. Taking care of your own backyard, building America for Americans. That seems to be a philosophy that the president has put forth since the beginnings of his presidency. Is that kind of the underguiding principle behind his foreign policy and behind his economic policies, which, as you say, are two sides of the same coin?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very nice way of combining the two into a unified whole, building America for Americans and all Americans. He's been very clear, even from his campaign in 2008 when he got into that verbal tiff with Joe the plumber over spreading the wealth around, that he very much believes that America is strongest when its wealth is more equally distributed, which he believes creates more opportunity for people of all backgrounds, and that America is not served by being the world's policeman, but rather by treating other people and other countries overseas with respect and with near equality. So I think that's a very nice way of putting the two sides together into one comprehensive whole.
Henry, second-term presidents, can they accomplish more than they did in their first term because of the fact that the pressure's off?
Historically, second-term presidencies have been a bit of a letdown, but that doesn't mean they have to be a letdown. President Reagan had a number of setbacks in his second term, but he also signed comprehensive tax reform, which helped set off sustained growth that lasted for a decade and a half through President Clinton's administration. And I think if he takes care not to overreach and to push too far, I think that he could have a very consequential second term.
Henry, I can't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to get in front of a computer or, more importantly, a history text to figure this one out. But has a second-term president ever had a successful presidency when he's had to fight a nonpartisan House?
You mean a House that's controlled by somebody from the other party?
Absolutely.
Well, President Reagan never had a Republican-controlled House during his entire 8 years of the presidency. So his tax reform bill was passed through a House that was controlled by Democrats. He was able to work across the aisle with the then chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, and with Democrat Senator Bill Bradley in the Senate, so that Republicans and Democrats came together for that. Now, in order to do that, that meant that both sides needed to give some ground. And so far, with the negotiations over the fiscal cliff, we haven't necessarily seen that either side has been willing to give enough ground to get something done. But it's also very early in the presidency. We'll see what happens in the coming years. Well,
last question for you, Henry. I was sort of gearing this towards the fiscal cliff to wrap up. If that deal with the fiscal cliff is signed before we go over it, and there's still some leeway here because most people are starting to call it a fiscal slope, would that indicate that the president has been able to reach across the aisle and unite the House?
I think it would depend on the nature of the deal. That one could imagine a deal signed very reluctantly by members of the House to avoid an even larger tax increase that they would be very unhappy about. I think if the president wants to have genuine bipartisan cooperation, he needs to give more on the spending side than so far he's been willing to do, at least in public, because Republicans believe that they can only justify increases in tax revenue if they have a significant reduction in spending. And if that's something that's on the offing, then I think we can find a deal that would actually meet with grudging acceptance on both sides. But if what we do is come up with something that's basically 80% of what the president wants, Republicans will feel very upset and will live to fight another day.
Well, Henry, speaking with you is much more edifying than reaching for my old American history and politics text, so thanks for this.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, and it's always a pleasure. That was Henry Olsen. He's the vice president at the American Enterprise Institute. Henry joined us live from Potomac, Maryland.